First story, they took more than my blood. It's hard to put into words what happened to me that night in 1978, but the memories are too vivid to ignore, too real to dismiss as a dream or some trick of my mind. It started like any other night. I was walking home from work in a quiet village in Nagano Prefecture, Japan. The air was crisp, and the cicadas had already quieted down for the evening. I remember glancing at my watch. It was just past 10 p.m. My route was familiar, a narrow, dirt path that cut through a stretch of forest before opening up to the small road leading to my house. I had taken this path hundreds of times, and nothing about it ever felt out of the ordinary. But that night, something was different. I noticed the silence first. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, almost suffocating. No wind, no rustling. Leaves, not even the distant hum of nighttime insects. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint glow in the trees ahead. At first I thought it might have been a lantern or some passing car light reflecting oddly. But as I got closer, the glow intensified, and the air around me grew heavy, almost electric. The glow wasn't just light, it was a presence. That's the best way I can describe it. My body felt frozen, like my legs wouldn't respond to my brain's command to turn back. The light shifted. No, it moved like it was alive, pulsating and flickering. Before I could make sense of it, I felt the air shift again, and a strange pressure built up in my ears, like when a plane is taking off. My head spun, and the next thing I knew, I wasn't standing in the forest anymore. I was lying on a cold, smooth surface, staring up at an impossibly bright, sterile light. It didn't look like any light fixture I'd ever seen. No bulb, no source, just a blinding radiance that seemed to come from everywhere. My arms felt numb, and when I tried to move, I realized I couldn't. That's when I noticed them, 3 figures standing around me. Their heads were bulbous, almost too large for their thin, frail bodies. Their eyes were massive and dark, taking up most of their faces, and though they didn't have mouths, I could feel them communicating with me, somehow, directly into my mind. A wave of dread washed over me as I noticed tubes running from their hands into my arms. But these weren't normal medical tubes. They pulsed almost like veins, and I could feel them drawing something from me. Not just blood, but something deeper. Something I can only describe as my essence. I could feel it. Whatever they were taking, it was more than physical. It was like a part of me, something vital, was being siphoned away through those pulsating tubes. The sensation wasn't exactly pain, but it was deeply uncomfortable, like a hollowing out from the inside. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't take a full breath, and my vision blurred at the edges. The figures didn't seem to care about my discomfort. They didn't move with any sense of urgency or concern. They operated with eerie precision, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. One of them moved closer to me, tilting its head slightly, studying me with those endless black eyes. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my voice wouldn't come. It was like my throat had been locked shut. That's when I noticed the room around me, if you could even call it a room. The walls weren't solid, but seemed to shift and ripple, like liquid metal frozen in motion. The air itself felt strange, thick but breathable, and there was this faint hum, almost a vibration, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. As I lay there, unable to move, I became aware of something even more disturbing. Images began flooding my mind. At first, they were flashes, strange landscapes bathed in red light, machines that defied logic, and unfamiliar constellations in the sky. Then the images became more personal, more invasive. Memories from my childhood, moments I hadn't thought about in years, played out in vivid detail. It was like they were pulling pieces of my life out of me, dissecting my very identity. I could feel them probing deeper, their presence in my mind like icy tendrils, sifting through my thoughts as if they were pages in a book. I felt exposed, utterly powerless, like they knew me better than I knew myself. The worst part was that I could sense their intent, not malicious but clinical. To them I wasn't a person, I was a specimen, a test subject. And just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I felt a sharp, searing sensation in my right arm. I managed to glance down and saw one of the tubes glowing faintly, as if whatever they were extracting had reached some kind of critical point. My head swam with dizziness, and I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness. But not before I caught a glimpse of one of the figures leaning in closer, its massive eyes reflecting my terror like twin black mirrors. When I woke up, I was still on that cold, unyielding surface, but something had changed. The figures were no longer standing around me. Instead, they were across the room, or space, or whatever this place was, hunched over what looked like a table of shimmering light. Their backs were to me, their movements deliberate yet alien, as if they were adjusting controls or studying something beyond my comprehension. I realized I could move my head slightly, and my body felt lighter, though I was still too weak to sit up. The tubes in my arms were gone, leaving behind faint circular marks that tingled unnaturally. My surroundings felt even more oppressive now that I was alone on the table. The air seemed charged, humming with a low, almost imperceptible vibration that burrowed into my skull. I couldn't decide if it was external or in my head. Then I noticed the ceiling, if you could call it that. It wasn't a solid surface, but rather a vast, swirling expanse of dim light and shadow, like a window into an endless void. It felt as though the entire space I was in existed outside of time, outside of anything I could understand. I tried to move, to slide off the table, but my body was sluggish, like it wasn't fully under my control. That's when I felt it, the presence. Not the figures, but something larger, something encompassing the entire space. It wasn't visible, but I could feel it observing me, its attention as palpable as a hand resting on my chest. A deep, primal fear settled into my bones, and I froze, hoping that whatever it was wouldn't notice me any further. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to take slow, shallow breaths, though the air tasted metallic, almost bitter. Suddenly, without warning, the figures turned in unison, their heads tilting slightly as if they'd heard something I couldn't. They moved toward me, their thin limbs gliding with unnatural fluidity. One of them raised a hand, and a soft, bluish light began emanating from its palm. The light wasn't warm. It was cold, piercing, like it reached inside me and stripped away every layer of protection I had left. I couldn't move, couldn't look away, as the light expanded, swallowing my vision entirely. My last coherent thought was a desperate, unanswered plea. Why me? When the light finally receded, I wasn't on the table anymore. I was standing, or at least I thought I was standing, in an entirely different place. It was impossible to tell if it was real or some sort of constructed illusion. The ground beneath me felt soft, yet it gave no sound when I shifted my weight. The air was still metallic, but now it carried an odd warmth, like it was alive. Surrounding me were massive structures that seemed to stretch infinitely upward, their surfaces smooth and seamless, glowing faintly like they were made of the same material as the tubes and walls I'd seen earlier. I didn't see the figures anymore, but their presence lingered, like a faint echo in my mind. As I looked around, the strangest thing happened. The structures began to shift, rearranging themselves as if they were responding to my thoughts. At first I thought it was random, but the longer I observed, the clearer it became. They were showing me something. The walls or shapes bent and folded into patterns, symbols that I couldn't understand but felt deeply meaningful, like they were meant to communicate something beyond words. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud or even particularly distinct, but it vibrated through me, filling my chest with a sensation I can only describe as unnatural. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard, more like a resonance, a frequency that bypassed my ears entirely and went straight into my body. It made my teeth ache and my vision blur, and as it grew stronger, I realized the shapes around me were reacting to it. The symbols became more chaotic, more erratic, flashing in and out of existence like they were being torn apart by the sound. I wanted to scream, but the vibration seemed to rob me of even that ability. Just as I felt like I was on the verge of losing my mind, I saw them again. The figures. But now they were different. They weren't solid like before. Their forms were translucent, shifting like smoke caught in a draft. They surrounded me, and for the first time, I felt something from them that wasn't cold or clinical. It was overwhelming. A flood of emotions that weren't my own. Confusion, curiosity, and something that felt disturbingly close to pity. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The sound, the shifting shapes, the figures, it all vanished, leaving me in complete, suffocating silence. The silence didn't bring relief. It was oppressive, a heavy emptiness that pressed against my chest. I stood there, or at least I think I did. My sense of time and space was completely fractured. My legs felt weak, like they might give out, beneath me at any moment, but I couldn't bring myself to sit or collapse. Then I noticed something horrifying. My hands. They weren't moving the way I wanted them to. I tried flexing my fingers, but they responded with a delay, like there was some barrier between my mind and my body. The faint circular marks on my arms where the tubes had been were glowing now, pulsing faintly with each erratic beat of my heart. I was terrified to look closer, afraid of what I might see, but I couldn't stop myself. The glow wasn't just light, it was alive. It felt like it was crawling under my skin, twisting through my veins, and no matter how much I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just inside me. It was changing me. Suddenly I was moving, but not by choice. My body began walking forward on its own, as if being pulled by an invisible thread. The structures around me seemed to part, creating a clear path that I was forced to follow. My heart pounded as my feet carried me further into the alien expanse. I passed what looked like pools of liquid light, rippling gently without any visible source of disturbance. In the strange reflections, I caught glimpses of things I couldn't comprehend, shadows moving in ways that didn't match the space I was in, figures that appeared and disappeared as if blinking in and out of existence. My mind felt like it was unraveling, grasping at shreds of logic in a place that seemed designed to strip it away. That's when I heard it again, the faint hum, the one that had burrowed into my skull earlier. Only now, it was clearer, sharper, like it was directly in my head. It wasn't a sound. It was a voice, but not a voice in any language I knew. It was fragmented, disjointed, yet somehow I understood it, not through words, but through the overwhelming feeling it conveyed. You are not ready. The words, or the feeling of those words, hit me like a wave, and for a moment I felt my knees buckle. Not ready? Ready for what? The message wasn't just a simple statement. It carried weight, a gravity that seemed to sink into the core of my being. The glowing marks on my arms pulsed again, this time brighter, faster, in sync with the hum, growing louder in my head. My body felt like it was vibrating, like every cell in me was being stretched and pulled in different directions. I fought against it, but it was like trying to swim against a riptide. The unseen force guiding me forward grew stronger, more insistent, pulling me towards something I couldn't see but could feel looming ahead. As I stumbled forward, the glowing structures around me shifted again, forming a massive archway that pulsed with the same rhythmic light as the marks on my arms. I didn't want to go through it. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to resist, but my body was no longer my own. My legs moved without permission, carrying me closer to whatever waited beyond the arch. As I passed under the arch, the space on the other side opened up into something that defied logic or reason. It wasn't a room or even a space in the way we understand it. It was infinite, a swirling void of light and darkness, filled with shapes and colors that twisted and folded into themselves. In the center of it all was something I can barely describe, a massive pulsating sphere of energy, radiating an overwhelming presence. It wasn't light or matter, but something else entirely. Looking at it felt like staring into the sun, yet I couldn't look away. The hum in my head became deafening, resonating with the pulsing of the sphere, and I realized the marks on my arms were glowing so brightly now that they were almost blinding. I could feel myself unraveling again, as if my very sense of self was being pulled apart, dissected, and examined. That voice, the same one that told me I wasn't ready, returned, but now it was stronger, clearer. It wasn't just speaking to me, it was inside me. Observe, learn, endure. Those 3 words echoed endlessly in my mind, repeating over and over until I thought they might drive me mad. Then, with no warning, the sphere flared, a burst of light that engulfed everything. The light was absolute. It wasn't just something I saw, it was something I felt. It burned through me, not with heat, but with a force that stripped everything away. Fear, thoughts, even the sense of who I was. For a moment, I didn't exist, or at least not in any way I could comprehend. I was part of the light, part of the hum, part of whatever that sphere was. I can't explain it fully, but it felt like I was being taken apart piece by piece. My memories, my emotions, everything that made me, sifted through and laid bare. There was no pain, but there was terror, a primal, inescapable terror of being reduced to nothing. Just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I was whole again, but I wasn't the same. I knew I wasn't. I could feel it deep inside me, something foreign and unexplainable. I was back on the table, lying under the same sterile, blinding light, but the air around me was different. It was colder, heavier, as if whatever had happened in that void had left a scar on the very space I occupied. The marks on my arms were dim now, almost gone, but the sensation of them remained, a faint, unnatural tingle that wouldn't fade. I was alone. The figures were gone, the hum was gone, and the room, or whatever it was, felt emptier than before. For a moment, I thought it might be over, but that hope dissolved when I realized I couldn't move again. My body was paralyzed, and I could only stare at the ceiling as faint vibrations began to ripple through the floor. It was then that I heard the voice one last time. It wasn't in my head anymore. It was around me, everywhere. "We will return." The words echoed low and deliberate, as if they were a promise, not a threat. Before I could even process what they meant, everything shifted again. The light above me grew brighter until it became unbearable, and then darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was lying face down in the dirt, back in the forest where it had all started. The first thing I noticed was the warmth of the sun on my skin, but it felt wrong, like I hadn't felt it in years. My body ached in ways I didn't understand, and my arms were completely numb. The marks were gone, but the memory of them burned just as vividly as the events themselves. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed back onto the ground. Whatever had happened up there, wherever there even was, had left its mark. And I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Not for me. I don't remember getting home that night. I don't remember anything after pulling myself up from the ground, stumbling through the forest with shaking legs and a pounding heart. It's all a blur, flashes of trees rushing past, the distant glow of my porch light, and the overwhelming sense that something was still watching me. When I finally made it inside, I locked every door and window, but it didn't help. The fear wasn't outside. It was inside me, lodged deep in a place I couldn't reach. I sat in the dark for hours, staring at my hands, waiting for something to happen, for the glow to return, for the hum to start again, but nothing came. It was almost worse that way, being left with nothing but the memory, the uncertainty. Days passed, then weeks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me. Not physically, but mentally. My thoughts didn't feel like my own anymore. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I'd hear that hum, again, so faint I could almost convince myself it was my imagination. Almost. It's been years since that night, and I still don't have answers. I've tried to forget, tried to move on. But how do you move on from something like that? I see the figures in my dreams, their bulbous heads and endless black eyes watching, waiting. Sometimes I wake up with that same numbness in my arms, that same hollow ache in my chest. I don't talk about it, not to my family, not to my friends. They wouldn't believe me, and honestly, I don't blame them. Some nights I sit by the window, staring up at the sky, wondering if they're still out there, wondering if they ever really left. And deep down, I know the truth. They didn't. They never do. Second story. Marked by the unknown. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to talk about this kind of stuff online, but after what happened that night, I don't know where else to turn. It was late August of 1993, and I was driving back home with my husband after visiting some friends. The road was quiet, just endless stretches of trees and open fields, the kind of scenery that usually makes you feel at peace. But that night, it felt different, like the air itself was heavier. I remember feeling uneasy, though I couldn't explain why at the time. My husband was talking about something, but I wasn't really listening. My eyes kept drifting toward the sky, and that's when I saw it. A set of lights, bright, too bright to be anything normal, hovering silently over the treetops. At first I thought it was a plane, but it wasn't moving like one. It was just there, still, watching. I didn't say anything right away, but I felt my chest tighten. Something wasn't right. Before I could even get the words out, the lights shifted. They blinked once, twice, and then moved. Fast, faster than anything I've ever seen. My husband must have noticed my reaction because he asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. I just kept watching as the lights suddenly shot across the sky and stopped dead in front of us, hovering above the road. That's when I felt it. A cold, creeping sensation that crawled up my spine and made the hair on my arms stand up. My husband slowed the car, and for a moment, neither of us said a word. The object above us was huge, disc-shaped, with a strange, pulsating glow around it. My mouth went dry. We just sat there staring until suddenly the headlights of our car flickered and died. The radio cut to static, and in that thick, oppressive silence, I swear I could feel something watching us, not just the craft, something inside it. I don't remember opening the car door. 1 second I was sitting there, frozen in place, and the next I was outside, standing in the middle of the road. My husband was still in the car, calling my name, but his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from underwater. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The lights from the craft above pulsed, and with each pulse, I felt this strange pull, like something deep inside me was being tugged at. And then I saw them. Shadows. tall, thin figures moving just beyond the light, their silhouettes unnaturally elongated against the darkness. They stood at the edge of the trees watching me. My legs felt like they were encased in concrete, and no matter how much I wanted to run, I couldn't. The figures stepped closer, their glowing red eyes piercing through the night. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I could feel them in my head, pushing into my thoughts like they were rummaging through my mind, searching for something. Then, everything happened at once. A deafening humming sound filled the air, vibrating through my bones, and a sudden wave of heat rolled over me. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my head as pain exploded behind my eyes. It was like they were inside me, crawling through my memories, pulling at things I didn't even know were there. I heard my husband yelling, his voice panicked and terrified, but I couldn't focus on anything other than the figures closing in. One of them reached out, its long, spindly fingers stretching toward me. The moment it touched my forehead, I felt it, burning, searing pain, like a brand being pressed into my skin. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and suddenly, everything went black. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the overwhelming sense of being completely powerless, like I was nothing more than an insect under a magnifying glass. When I came to, I was lying on my back in the middle of the road, staring up at the night sky. The stars looked different, brighter, almost too sharp, like they didn't belong there. My whole body ached, but the worst pain was in my abdomen. It felt like something heavy had been pressing down on me. I sat up slowly, my hand shaking, and that's when I noticed it. A mark right below my navel, an odd circular shape burned into my skin, red and raw, like a fresh wound. I touched it, and a sharp electric pain shot through my entire body. My husband was by my side in an instant, his face pale and drenched in sweat. He kept asking me what happened, but I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't even know how much time had passed. The car was still in the same place, but it felt like the entire world had shifted slightly, like reality itself was off by just a fraction. My husband's voice was frantic, but I barely heard him. All I could focus on was the eerie silence around us, as if the night had swallowed every single sound. We scrambled back into the car, and my husband fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling so badly that he dropped them twice before finally getting the engine to start. The headlights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the road ahead, but we didn't care. We just wanted to get away. As we sped down the empty road, I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see those glowing red eyes staring back at me from the darkness. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. No matter how much distance we put between ourselves and that spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. My husband kept glancing at me, his eyes filled with fear and something else. Doubt. I could tell he was questioning if what we saw was real, but I didn't have that luxury. The burning mark on my skin was proof enough. Something had happened out there, something beyond explanation. And deep down I knew this wasn't over. Whatever they did to me, whatever they wanted, it wasn't finished yet. When we finally got home, I locked every door and window, but it didn't make me feel any safer. My whole body was still trembling, and the mark on my abdomen throbbed with a dull, insistent pain. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, lifting my shirt to get a better look at it. The shape was precise, almost too perfect, like it had been branded with surgical precision. My husband hovered behind me, staring over my shoulder in disbelief. "It's just a rash," he mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, I think he knew the truth, but it was easier to pretend. I didn't argue with him. I couldn't. How could I explain the way those figures had made me feel, like I was nothing more than an experiment? I traced the edges of the mark with my fingers, and a strange tingling sensation spread through my body, like a static charge building beneath my skin. I felt like I didn't belong in my own body anymore. It was like something inside me had shifted, like I wasn't entirely me anymore. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The tall, dark shapes standing in the trees, their red eyes burning like coals in the darkness. I could still hear the low hum vibrating deep inside my skull, a constant reminder that they had been there, that they had touched me. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I sat up in bed, gasping for air, and then I heard it, a faint clicking sound coming from outside the window. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head, and for a split second I saw it. Something moving just beyond the glass, a tall figure standing perfectly still in the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew the truth. They were still watching. The days that followed felt unreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My body never felt the same after that night. There was this constant sense of heaviness, like something foreign was inside me, lurking just beneath the surface. The mark on my abdomen never faded. In fact, it seemed to grow darker, almost like it was sinking into my skin. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but strange things kept happening. Electronics in the house would glitch whenever I walked by. Lights flickering, the TV turning to static. Even my watch would stop working randomly. And then there were the dreams. Every night I'd see them. The same glowing red eyes, the same suffocating darkness, and that same overwhelming feeling of being watched. But the worst part? Sometimes I'd wake up with dirt on my feet, like I had been outside, though I had no memory of leaving my bed. My husband noticed too, and the way he looked at me changed, like he was afraid of what I might say if he asked the right questions. I started avoiding mirrors. Every time I looked into one, I didn't recognize myself anymore. My skin looked pale, almost sickly, and my eyes, they weren't mine. There was something different in them, something distant. I tried to go about my normal routine, going to work, running errands, but the paranoia was eating me alive. Every shadow felt too long, every silence too deep. I kept expecting to turn a corner and see those figures waiting for me, standing just out of reach. And the worst part, I started noticing them everywhere. At first it was just fleeting glimpses, strange shapes at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look. But then, one evening, I saw one standing outside my house. Just standing. There, motionless, bathed in the dull glow of the streetlight. I wanted to scream, to wake my husband, but I couldn't move. I just stood there staring, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I don't know how long I stayed frozen, like that, but when I finally moved, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried until I couldn't anymore. I started losing time. Hours would pass, and I'd have no recollection of what I had been doing. I'd find myself in different rooms of the house, staring at the walls, unable to remember how I got there. My husband caught me once, standing in the backyard in the middle of the night, barefoot and shivering, just staring up at the sky. I didn't even know I had left the house. He stopped asking questions after that. I think he was too scared of the answers. But the worst part wasn't the missing time, it was the feeling that something had been done to me. Sometimes I'd wake up with strange bruises in places I couldn't explain, tiny puncture marks along my arms and legs that hadn't been there the night before. My hands would tremble, and there were moments when I felt disconnected, like my body wasn't mine anymore. I wanted to go to a doctor, but how do you explain something like this? I think I was abducted by aliens isn't exactly something you can say without people looking at you like you're crazy. One morning, I woke up to find something worse. The mark on my abdomen had changed. It wasn't just a circular burn anymore. It had deepened, the edges sharper, and in the center, a strange, almost geometric pattern had started to appear. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong on human skin. I tried to cover it up, but the sensation of it beneath my clothes made me nauseous. That same day, I noticed something else. My sense of time had become off. The days felt shorter, but not in a normal way. It was like the world around me was moving at a different speed, and I was just slightly out of sync with it. The sound of clocks ticking felt too loud, and I kept seeing things out of place. Objects where they shouldn't be. People looking at me strangely, like they knew something I didn't. I felt like I was being watched, not just by them, but by everyone. I couldn't trust anything anymore, not even myself. It was around this time that I started hearing it. A faint, almost imperceptible humming sound that never seemed to go away. It wasn't coming from outside or from any device in the house. It was inside me. I could feel it vibrating through my bones. A low, pulsing frequency that seemed to get louder when I was alone. At first I thought I was imagining it, but soon it became impossible to ignore. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling that hum coursing through me like an electric current. My husband never heard it, no matter how many times I asked him to listen. I stopped mentioning it after a while. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind, but deep down I knew something had changed in me. I wasn't just being watched anymore. Whatever they did to me that night, it was still inside me, still affecting me. The worst part was that I could feel them, like they were waiting for something. And then the blackout started. They weren't like before, where I just lose track of time. These were different. I'd wake up in places I didn't remember going to, once in the driver's seat of my car, parked miles away from home. Another time I found myself standing in the shower, fully clothed, the water ice cold, my hands covered in dirt. Each time there were more marks on my body, tiny, almost surgical incisions that healed too quickly, as if they had been there for weeks instead of hours. I stopped sleeping altogether, afraid of what I might wake up to next. My husband grew distant, and I could see the fear in his eyes whenever he looked at me. He started staying late at work, barely speaking to me when he was home. I didn't blame him. I didn't even recognize myself anymore. My reflection in the mirror felt like a stranger, someone hollow, someone broken. And through it all, I kept seeing those red eyes, watching from the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. I don't know how long I lived like that, trapped in this endless cycle of fear and confusion. Days blurred together, and I stopped trying to pretend that everything was normal. I quit my job, stopped talking to friends, and barely left the house. The nights were the worst. I'd lay in bed, clutching the sheets, my eyes locked on the ceiling, waiting for something to happen, and it always did. The humming would start first, vibrating through my skull, followed by the faint flickering of the lights. Then, the shadows would shift, just barely, but enough to make my heart race. And each time, I felt them getting closer. I don't remember the exact moment it happened again, but I do remember waking up outside, in the same spot on that lonely stretch of road. My bare feet were caked in mud, and the mark on my abdomen burned like it was on fire. I looked up, and they were there, standing in the distance, silent and unmoving. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to listen. I could only watch as they stared at me, their red eyes cutting through the darkness like knives. Then, just like before, everything went black. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me. My husband was gone. I don't know if he left for good or if he was just afraid to stay near me any longer. I couldn't blame him either way. I checked my body in the mirror, and the mark had changed again. The pattern was more intricate now, almost like it was growing. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at it, feeling that deep, gnawing sense of dread creeping up my spine. Whatever they did to me that night wasn't over. It would never be over. And the worst part, I don't even know what they want. I can still feel them sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone, just on the edge of my perception, watching, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Some nights I wonder if they'll come back again, or if they never really left. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story: What the Forest Hides. I've been hunting in the Alaskan wilderness since I was old enough to hold a rifle. There's a kind of peace out there, the kind only found in the silence of towering trees and snow-covered ground. But that silence, it's not comforting anymore. It was late October 1989, and I was out with 3 buddies, Greg, Dale, and Ronnie. We were about 60 miles from the nearest town, deep in the forest, setting up camp near a frozen lake. The day was uneventful, tracking moose, sharing stories around the fire, the usual. But as night fell, I noticed something. The woods were too quiet. I don't mean the typical stillness of nature. It was an oppressive silence, like even the wind had stopped. We shrugged it off, though. Greg joked that maybe the bears were hibernating early. I laughed along, but my stomach was in knots. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I don't know why. Maybe a sound, maybe instinct. The fire had almost gone, out, leaving just embers glowing faintly. As my eyes adjusted, I realized something was wrong. Greg, who was supposed to be on watch, was gone. His rifle was still leaning against the log where he'd been sitting. That's when I saw the light. It was this faint bluish glow filtering through the trees, almost like moonlight, but colder. It didn't flicker or waver like a flashlight, it just hovered. I shook Ronnie awake, and before I could even explain, he froze, staring at the glow. The light grew brighter, and I swear to God it wasn't natural. It didn't cast shadows. It just consumed the darkness. Dale crawled out of his tent, mumbling something about Greg playing tricks, but as soon as he saw the light, he stopped dead in his tracks. None of us said a word. The air felt thick, almost electric, like the static before a thunderstorm. Then came the sound, a low hum that I could feel in my chest more than I could hear with my ears. It was steady, rhythmic, like a vibration that seemed to pull at the edges of my mind. My skin started to tingle, and every hair on my body stood on end. We didn't have time to react. In an instant, the light exploded forward, swallowing the campsite. It wasn't like a spotlight or a beam. It was everywhere, all around us. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My body wouldn't move. I was completely frozen, not like I was scared stiff, but like something was physically holding me. I could see Ronnie to my left, his eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down his face. Dale had fallen to the ground, his arms twitching like he was trying to fight whatever force had him. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't even feel it. All I could do was watch as the light pulsed and shifted, almost alive, and then I felt myself being pulled upward. The sensation of being lifted wasn't like flying. It was more like my body was weightless, but not by choice, like I was a piece of metal caught in a magnet's pull. My vision blurred as I was dragged upward into the light. I couldn't move my head, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ronnie and Dale rising too, their bodies limp like rag dolls. The light was blinding, and yet somehow I could still see through it, as if it was both solid and transparent at the same time. My chest felt like it was going to explode. My lungs burned as if I wasn't breathing, though I couldn't even gasp for air. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The light dimmed, and I found myself lying on a smooth, cold surface. The air was damp and smelled metallic, almost like blood but sharper. My head throbbed and my vision was spotty, but I could make out shapes above me. They weren't human. Shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense, bending and twisting in the periphery of my sight. I tried to focus, but it was like my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I felt exposed, like I was being studied, and my body wouldn't respond to my desperate attempts to move. My arms, my legs, even my eyes, nothing worked. I was utterly helpless. A strange sensation began spreading through my body, like a faint vibration under my skin. It started at my feet and worked its way up, an unnatural warmth that was neither comforting nor painful, just wrong. I felt like my insides were being scanned, layer by layer, as if I was being dissected without a single cut. Shadows passed over me, and then I felt pressure on my chest, like something was pinning me down. My heart was racing, but I still couldn't breathe. I don't know how long I was in that state, but at some point I became aware of a sound. It wasn't the hum from before. It was sharper, mechanical, almost like clicking, but faster and more erratic. I felt something cold touch my forehead, then my arm. It wasn't a hand. It was smooth, almost wet, and it sent a jolt through my body. That's when I finally saw them. They leaned in close, their heads elongated, eyes black and endless, reflecting. No light. Their faces were expressionless, yet I felt their intent, like they were digging into my mind. My thoughts weren't safe anymore. They weren't just looking at me, they were inside me. The things, whatever they were, didn't speak, not out loud. But I heard them. Or maybe felt them. It's hard to explain, like thoughts that weren't my own, filling my head with images and sensations that didn't belong to me. Flashes of places I've never seen. A vast emptiness of stars and dark shapes moving in the void. My body felt like it was disintegrating, coming apart piece by piece. But I could still see myself lying there, whole. It was as if they were pulling me into two different planes of existence at the same time. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Then the pressure shifted. Something wrapped around my wrist, and I felt the sharp prick of what could have been a needle, though I didn't see it. A cold rush ran through my veins, followed by a wave of dizziness so intense I thought I'd pass out. My vision started to blacken around the edges, but before I lost consciousness completely, I felt a sudden crushing sense of despair, not my own though. It was coming from them, or through them, like they were showing me something. Regret? Anger? Fear? I don't know. But it overwhelmed me. A flood of emotions so foreign and immense that my mind couldn't hold it all. I wanted it to stop, wanted to scream, but I was nothing more than a prisoner in my own body. When I came to, I was back on the forest floor. The light was gone. The campsite looked the same, but there was something off, like the colors were muted. The edges of everything slightly blurred. My body was heavy, almost numb, as if I hadn't used it in days. I sat up slowly, every muscle screaming in protest, and that's when I saw Ronnie. He was lying a few feet away, his face pale and his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. I crawled over to him, shaking him, shouting his name, but he didn't move. He was breathing, barely, but he wouldn't respond. Dale was slumped against a tree, holding his head and rocking back and forth. When I called out to him, he flinched like I'd hit him. His eyes darted around wildly, and he kept muttering, "They're still here. They're still here." My heart sank as I realized Greg was still missing. I staggered to my feet, calling his name, scanning the woods, but there was no sign of him. The silence was back. No wind, no rustling leaves, no wildlife. Just that oppressive, unnatural stillness. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in panic, but eventually I noticed something carved into the dirt near the fire pit. It was a symbol, one I didn't recognize, but it felt intentional, like a mark left behind. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop staring at that symbol. It wasn't something Greg would have done. He wasn't the type to mess around with weird carvings. It looked deliberate, almost precise, like it had been etched with a tool rather than scratched with a stick. The lines were clean, forming an intricate shape that seemed to pulse in my vision, though I knew it wasn't actually moving. I reached out to touch it, but the second my fingers brushed the dirt, a sharp pain shot up my arm, like I'd been shocked. I yanked my hand back, and that's when the humming started again. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. That same low vibration that felt like it was crawling inside my skull. Dale heard it too. He froze mid-rock, his bloodshot eyes snapping toward the trees. "No, no, no, no," he mumbled, clutching his knees like a terrified child. I wanted to grab him, to shake him out of it, but my own fear had me rooted to the spot. The sound grew louder, closer, and my chest tightened with the same paralyzing pressure from before. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then, just beyond the tree line, the light appeared again. Faint at first, but growing stronger with every passing second. I thought it was over. I thought they were coming back for us. My instincts screamed to run, but I couldn't. Dale started sobbing, rocking faster, muttering incoherent words between gasps. Ronnie still hadn't moved, his breathing shallow and ragged. The light crept closer, illuminating the edges of the trees, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw shapes moving within it. Tall, slender figures, almost blending into the glow. Then the symbol on the ground lit up. It wasn't like a fire or a glow stick. It was more like the dirt itself had become a source of light, bright and pulsating in sync with the hum. My stomach turned as I watched it, the lines vibrating, distorting the air around them. I didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong, unnatural. And then, just like that, the light vanished. The hum stopped. The forest returned to its eerie silence, as if nothing had ever happened. I collapsed to my knees, my body trembling, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But the symbol, it was still there, faintly glowing, a reminder that whatever had happened wasn't over. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that faintly glowing mark in the dirt. Time felt warped. The moon was still in the sky, but it seemed frozen, like it hadn't moved an inch since all this started. Dale was huddled by the tree, his eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. Ronnie finally stirred, letting out a low groan, but his eyes were glassy, unfocused. When I tried to help him sit up, he flinched away from me, his body trembling like he'd just come out of a nightmare. Greg was still nowhere to be found, and the weight of his absence was crushing me. We couldn't just leave him out there, but I was terrified of going back into the trees. Every shadow felt alive, every rustle of leaves a threat. My mind kept replaying what had happened, trying to make sense of it. but there was no logic to cling to. The humming, the light, the figures, none of it fit into the world I thought I knew. I found myself whispering Greg's name under my breath, as if the sound alone could will him back to us. But the only answer was the empty stillness of the forest. I forced myself to stand, even though my legs felt like they might give out. "We have to find him," I said, my voice shaking, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to Ronnie, Dale, or just myself. Dale didn't respond. He just kept rocking, his lips moving in silent prayer or panic. I couldn't tell which. Ronnie finally looked at me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. What if he's gone?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I felt it too. That sickening certainty that Greg wasn't coming back. Still, I couldn't just give up. I grabbed a flashlight from the gear pile, but the moment I turned it on, the beam flickered and died. Batteries were fresh. I tested another flashlight. Same thing. My hands shook as I checked my rifle, only to find the mechanism jammed, though I'd cleaned it just the day before. It was as if everything we'd brought out here was being sabotaged one by one. "This isn't right," I muttered, and Ronnie nodded weakly. But what could we do? We were stranded in the middle of nowhere. No weapons, no working lights, and no clue what had just happened, or if it was over. The hours crawled by in a haze of fear and exhaustion. None of us slept. We didn't speak much either, except for the occasional desperate whisper from Ronnie or Dale. Every now and then, I'd hear something. A faint crack of a branch, a rustle in the leaves. But when I shined what little light we had into the trees, there was nothing there. The symbol in the dirt had faded, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. It felt like crossing a line I didn't want to cross. At one point, just as dawn began to edge over the horizon, I thought I heard footsteps, light and deliberate, circling the campsite. I froze, gripping my useless rifle like it was still worth something, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, and it was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate crunches in the snow, as though something, or someone, was pacing just beyond the reach of our vision. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Then silence. Whatever it was had stopped moving, but I could feel it there, watching us. It took every ounce of courage I had to step out of the tense shadow and call out. "Greg?" My voice sounded small, weak, even to me. No answer. I called again, louder this time, but the woods swallowed my words. Just as I was about to retreat back to the others, I saw something. At first I thought it was a reflection, a glint of light bouncing off something metallic. But as I squinted, I realized it was eyes. Two large, unblinking eyes, just barely visible between the trees. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the gear behind me. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stayed fixed on me like they were studying my every move. My mouth went dry and I couldn't speak, couldn't even call for Ronnie or Dale. Then the eyes tilted, as if the thing was cocking its head in curiosity. The movement snapped me out of my paralysis and I scrambled, backward, clutching the rifle. "Get out of here!" I screamed, my voice cracking. But the eyes didn't budge. They lingered for another second, then vanished, retreating silently into the woods. Whatever it was still out there, and it wasn't afraid of us. When the eyes disappeared, I collapsed back into the snow, shaking uncontrollably. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow, like I'd just sprinted a mile. I crawled back toward the campsite, my hands numb and trembling. Ronnie rushed over to help me up, his face pale with terror. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice trembling. I couldn't find the words. How could I explain that I'd seen something watching us, something that wasn't human? I just shook my head, muttering, "We have to go. We can't stay here." Dale finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It won't matter," he said, staring at the ground. "They'll find us, no matter where we go." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't want to believe him. I couldn't. We gathered what little gear still worked, mostly just our packs and a few knives, and decided to head back toward the truck. The hike back would take hours, but staying felt like suicide. As we left the campsite, I glanced back one last time. The symbol was completely gone, like it had never been there. My stomach churned as I turned away, the weight of dread following us into the trees. The journey back was hell. Every step felt heavier than the last, the forest pressing in on us like it was alive, watching, waiting. Ronnie kept looking over, his shoulder flinching at every sound. I couldn't blame him. I felt it too, the sense that we were being followed. The woods were still unnervingly quiet, but every so often I'd catch a faint rustle or the snap of a twig. It wasn't wildlife. It was deliberate, like something was mirroring our movements. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the clearing where the truck was parked. Relief hit me like a wave, but it was short-lived. The truck wasn't how we left it. The doors were wide open, and the inside was torn apart. Seats slashed, dashboard cracked, and the ignition melted. I don't mean burned. It looked like it had been liquefied, the metal warped and dripping. "This isn't possible," Ronnie whispered, his voice breaking. He dropped to his knees, his hands pulling at his hair. Dale just stood there, staring blankly at the wreckage, as if he'd already resigned himself to whatever fate was waiting for us. I was about to say something, anything, when the hum started again, low and distant, but growing louder. The hum was all around us, vibrating through the air and into my bones. I clutched my head, trying to block it out. But it wasn't just sound. It was something deeper, something that crawled under my skin. The light appeared again, faint at first, but it grew stronger with each pulse of the hum. Ronnie screamed, scrambling back toward the woods, but he didn't get far. A blinding flash lit up the clearing, and when I looked, he was gone. No sign of him, not even footprints in the snow where he'd been standing. Dale dropped to his knees, his head in his hands, muttering incoherently. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The light swirled, bending and shifting like liquid, and in its center, I saw the figures again. Tall, slender, their forms blending into the brightness. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but there wasn't one. They didn't belong here. They didn't belong anywhere. One of them stepped forward, its head tilting in that same unnatural way, and I felt my body start to lift again. The paralyzing pressure returned, locking me in place as the light consumed everything. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light was gone, the hum was gone, and I was alone. The truck was still there, mangled and useless, but Ronnie and Dale were nowhere to be found. The forest was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, heavy and oppressive, as if the woods were holding their breath. I fell to my knees, my entire body shaking, and stared at the empty clearing. I don't remember how I made it out of there. It's all a blur, stumbling through the trees, my mind racing with flashes of the light, the figures, the hum. When I finally reached the nearest town, it was like waking from a nightmare, but the nightmare hasn't ended. I still hear the sometimes, faint and distant, like it's following me. The forest is no longer a place of peace. It's a doorway, and I know they'll come back through it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will. And when they do, I won't. be able to stop them. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.